I have a bunch of stuff in front of me, and I'm just going to kind of work my way through it so I can stay on track. And I'm going to rely on your expertise to unpack some of these things. I'm a total layman when it comes to understanding. I'll be honest, the basic science involved. I mean, I'm not a gene editor. I don't understand any of those things, and I feel like that's okay because your average person is also sitting in the same place that I am. So, your report started off in 2017 when a U.S. health official visited the Wuhan Institute of Virology and was allowed to tour the facility because it received U.S. funding. Could you explain why the U.S. would fund a virology lab in China in the first place?
So there is a very strong argument to be made for international collaboration, that advances science in many ways. In the case of coronaviruses, which was the research being funded in 2017, had a giant SARS outbreak in China in 2002, 2003. A great number of scientists turned their attention to studying coronaviruses with the question, what are possible pandemic pathogens? What could cause the next pandemic? Um, the bats and the bat caves where these coronaviruses could be found, many of them are in China. That is the place to study them. So there were a group of scientists, some in the US, some in China, who began collaborating, going and visiting bat caves in Yunnan province, bringing back samples, researching them, testing them at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, some of that research many scientists view as unnecessarily risky, in which they were creating chimeric viruses and testing how those viruses could evolve to become more infectious to humans. Some scientists say that research is just risk starting a pandemic. So there was sort of debate going on about the merits of that research, the wisdom of that research, the risks involved. But, the fact of the matter is that research was centralized in Wuhan, China, at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was, while not next to, quite near to the Hunan seafood market where the pandemic first emerged.
Is the argument for doing that type of research it's better to get in front of the power curve and understand what is possible as opposed to reacting to something unexpectedly?
That is the argument, that you're doing essentially predictive research to try to figure out what could turn into a pandemic, which would, the argument goes, give you time to develop countermeasures and vaccines. But there's an argument against it. And as my article revealed, there were a number of government scientists who had been sounding the alarm all along. So the argument against it is you're collaborating with an autocratic country where the scientists are not free simply to do civilian research. So there's a Chinese government doctrine called military civil fusion, which basically says, hey, civilian scientists, you need to hand off the fruits of your research to military scientists who can potentially weaponize that research. And hey, funding agencies in the US, you don't necessarily know once you give money, once you're funding this, you're thinking that allows you to walk into the Wuhan Institute of Virology and see what's going on. But the fact of the matter is, you can't necessarily know what's happening in a closed country, in a scientific setting where military scientists are working, sometimes in collaboration with civilian scientists. So one of the things I uncovered is that there were scientists with the Department of Energy, which is a massive science and technology agency, which were sounding the alarm about these kinds of collaborations, specifically for years.
I think a reasonable person would listen to what you're saying and say, why, if we were interested in this research and we can agree that it's better to be proactive than reactive, and we could probably save more lives by doing so, why not do the research in the United States, if we're worried about an autocratic government, if we're worried about the complications of having that military or at least government representative involved there, and I understand that that is geographically where the strains that they were studying were originating from, but I'll go to something in the article that you wrote where Canada sent Ebola to the Wuhan Institute. So it's not like it's impossible for these things to be transferred back and forth. If the concern is there, why not create that level of security and study these things here in the United States?
Absolutely. And we do study these in the United States. So, for example, some of the coronavirus research that was risky was being conducted at a secure lab at the University of North Carolina under what are called BSL-3 conditions or BSL-3 plus conditions, with BSL-4 being the most secure. But what happened in 2015 onward is that these very secure laboratories, BSL-4, began being built in other parts of the world. So the milestone in Wuhan is the creation of China's first BSL-4 laboratory, supposedly the most secure, at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So that was seen as an opportunity by Western nations, by Canada, by the US, to have a collaboration, to collaborate with Chinese scientists in a way that would benefit scientists. But what happened, and that's where my article opens, a US official went in there in 2017, got the initial grand tour of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and got some really concerning information. So she was told by Chinese scientists working there, we do not feel we have enough staff, appropriately trained staff, to safely operate this facility. So that was a concerning piece of information, number one. Then they told her, we're struggling to obtain Ebola samples to launch our Ebola research program. So we're thinking of reverse engineering Ebola and essentially creating it in a lab. Now, scientists can argue, is that really risky if you're doing reverse genetics in a BSL-4 lab where it's built for that? There are safeguards. This is a technique that's widely used. On the other hand, those folks, the lady from the NIH who went to visit, emailed with her supervisor back in the US, and they were like, you know what? That information is going to really alarm some people in the US government. Let's not put it in the State Department cable. As the emails I obtained, her supervisor says, delete that comment. Don't include that information. So NIH officials were well aware in 2017 that there were notable risks at this lab, but also there would be the perception of risk that could thwart a collaboration.
It's an interesting value proposition. Do we tell the total truth and accept the outcome, or do we lie by omission and hopefully continue to drive forward with funding and collaboration? As a person, my personal belief is that integrity is of the utmost importance. And if it was me making that decision, which I am nowhere near qualified or educated to do so, but had they called me up on my cell phone and said, hey, what should we do here? My answer would have been tell the truth, because things that might alarm people or things that scare us, that's a natural reaction from the human body that maybe we should pay attention to these things. You mentioned the capability of the facility in Wuhan. A tool is only as important, or I shouldn't say important, it's only as effective as the hand that wields it. So having a level 4 facility is an amazing thing. Not having the staff to be able to operate it effectively and having that risk ratio start to rise more vertically, Those are two very distinct problems. I don't care how great your facility is if nobody knows how to use it. There's a reason we don't give the keys to Lamborghinis to 16-year-olds that just get their driver's license. It would be an irresponsible move. And I'm glad you mentioned those two things. You covered the next two bullet points. Do you
Let me just add one
Please.
thing, Andy, which is, at that moment, the NIH is choosing to shield a collaboration that it thinks is very important for science. So that is, from what I can tell, the motivation.
Yeah.
On the other hand, as the former commander of U.S. AMRID told me, not to share that information with other government officials is irresponsible. Maybe the truth falls somewhere in between, but those were the issues at play at that moment.
Well, we have the good fortune to be able to look back on history and, of course, make much more educated, at least have more educated thoughts. And I would like to think that most people don't operate maliciously. So I can imagine that that person with the information at that time, not knowing that a pandemic was a few years ahead, probably thought they were making the right decision. But looking back now, with what we know came from that, I'm just curious your personal thoughts. Do you think that that was a negligent decision by the officials at the NIAID?
I think the way I would put it is this, which is the NIH had its own concerns about what was going on in that laboratory. Fast forward to the start of the pandemic, and of course now we know, because of reporting, because of FOIA, because of research done by others, that those concerns were quite strong. I mean, there was a conference call on February 1st, 2020, right at the start of the pandemic, with real consideration given to the question of whether COVID-19 had originated from the laboratory. Part of the issue that was being weighed then was the knowledge that there was risky research being done at the WIV in inappropriately low biocontainment levels. So BSL-2, there was an acknowledgement that it was like the Wild West there. It was one of the, statements that was made early on. So, connecting the dots up, yeah, would it have been important, I think, for concerns to be disclosed all the way along? Absolutely.